Well, the Glasgow summit is still ongoing, but world leaders have long left the summit on their private jets, no less. So what has actually been achieved? Because not everyone is on the net zero path by 2050. Some earlier, some a little later. Joining me live now is the New South Wales Treasurer Matt Kean. He's also the Energy and Climate Change Minister. Thanks so much for your time. Now, you've always led the way proudly in New South Wales for net zero by 2050. Will you legislate that target?
Well, what we will do is have the policies in place to ensure that we hit the target, but do so in a way that's going to reduce our emissions and grow our economy. That's exactly what we're doing here in New South Wales. With the policies that we've put in place, we're not only going to reduce our emissions between 47 and 52% by 2030, we're going to do it in a way that's going to turbocharge investment, particularly into rural and regional New South Wales, create jobs and drive our prosperity like we've never seen before. So this is not only a case to protect our environment, this is an economically rational position to take in the interest of growing the prosperity of New South Wales.
If you're so committed, though, why wouldn't you legislate it?
Well, what we've done is we've got a clear target. In regulation, we've got a net zero target. In regulation, we've got a 50% reduction target by 2030. And more importantly, we've legislated the policies that are going to help get us there, like our energy infrastructure roadmap, the biggest renewable energy plan in the nation, which is going to see $32 billion worth of private investment going into rebuilding our electricity system to see unprecedented amounts of wind and solar, pumped hydro, and battery storage coming into the system that will help lower household bills by on average $130 per annum and business bills by around $430 per annum, create jobs and drive our prosperity. So why wouldn't you want to reduce our emissions?
Sure, but why won't you legislate it? I don't really understand. With all these things said, all these great investments and regulations, why you wouldn't commit the Parliament to doing such a thing?
Well, Laura, I think it's pretty clear. We do have it in the law that we will reduce our emissions by, we'll get to net zero by 2050, and we have it in the law that we'll reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, which is up there with the most ambitious countries in the world. So I'm not going to play your word games here today. What I'm going to do is focus on having ambitious targets and the policies legislated in place that are going to help us hit it and do it in a way that's economically
But you know
rational.
how important, I mean, you've seen these climate wars over decades at a federal level. You know really how important bipartisanship is in getting things done long term. And we're talking about 2050 targets. It's bipartisanship that you really need. So why wouldn't you try and bind Labor? I know you'd like to think that you're probably going to be in government for the next 20 or 30 years, but Labor's going to have to rule at some stage in New South Wales.
We do have our targets in the law. They're regulated that we will hit a net zero emissions target by 2050 and a 50% emissions reduction target by 2030. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to go further by putting in place more policies that are going to reduce our emissions and grow our economy. But that's only what we're going to do. Reduce our emissions in ways that make economic sense to do so. They're the policies that we'll pursue. They're the policies that we'll legislate.
You've previously been quite outspoken and you haven't been alone in doing this, critical of the federal government's policies and targets on climate change. What do you think about what they took to Glasgow?
Laura, you'll just have to repeat that if you don't mind. Sorry, I had a truck running past.
Well, we love the sound of productivity, but what do you think of the federal government's plan? You've been critical of them in the past. What do you think about the plan it took to Glasgow? Is it the right one?
Well, I think that it's great that the federal government took a plan to get to net zero by 2050 to Glasgow, but clearly more needs to be done. We need to see more ambitious interim targets, and definitely what the Commonwealth government put forward was not good enough. Already, the different states and territories around the nation, if you just adopted the average of their 2030 targets, you'd be hitting a 35% emissions reduction target. And you do it in a way that's going to grow our economy. So I think our federal government should be more ambitious, not just because it's the right thing for our planet, but because it's the right thing for our economy. It makes economic sense to do so. By not getting to net zero, that means that as the world decarbonises, other countries will grab the opportunities that are emerging to provide the rest of the world with the minerals, with the renewable energy, with the new technology that we are really well placed to do. So we should be winning this race because it's in our economic interest to do so.
So you say what the Commonwealth put forward was not good enough. So you're saying that they should have and should have had taken to Glasgow a 2030 target?
I think that the federal government should be more ambitious when it comes to tackling the issue of climate change. We know that no country on the planet is better placed to take advantage of these huge changes to the global economy than Australia. We've got some of the best renewable resources anywhere in the world, and we can not only use those resources to help lower our power bills for families and businesses here domestically, but we can export the products, materials and energy resources that the rest of the world is going to need if they're going to get to net zero. Now, the reality is that today 70% of the countries we do trade with have committed to net zero emissions. So the markets that have previously been taking our coal and fossil fuels are starting to look for new alternatives, and we're really well placed to provide them. So if you don't think that the environment and the moral arguments are enough to take action on climate change, then certainly the economic ones are even more compelling. So we should do this, particularly as a Conservative government who always believes that we have a contract between the generations and a responsibility to hand the planet to our kids and the economy to our kids better than we found it.
Would you phase out coal in the Hunter?
Well, let's be very clear about this. Nothing domestic policymakers is going to do is going to help or harm coal domestically. The future of coal is in the hands of foreign governments and foreign companies. And we know that today, with 70% of the world going to net zero, that means there will be a limited life on coal. So we need to prepare for that reality.
Okay.
We can't stop the future, but we can manage the risk, and that's what we're trying to do here. That's why we need to do things like diversify the economies of the Hunter to create new industries and new opportunities so that those workers in existing industries have a new high-paying job in new industries, and that's the responsibility of government. That's what we're focused on here. So this is not about closing down existing industries. Those decisions will be made outside of our control. We need to support existing industries, but also look to create new ones that will create new opportunities for economic prosperity, particularly in those areas like the Hunter and the Illawarra.
Well, Matthias Cormann's talking about things like removing subsidies for fossil fuels. Is that the kind of thing that you could do, that artificial support, if you like?
Well, I mean, Matthias Cormann has, changed his position on a number of fronts.
You'd welcome that,
what
wouldn't
we're
you?
seeing is that absolutely, I welcome it. And I welcome removing the politics and the division and the misinformation out of this debate. Let's get the facts on the table. The world is changing. We need to reduce our carbon footprint globally if we're going to ensure that we protect our planet and hand it to our kids better than we found it.
Okay.
And we need to be looking at a range of policy options to do that. But what I'm focused on is the policy options that are going to reduce our emissions but not hurt our economy. In fact, they're going to help our economy. They're going to create jobs, drive investment, raise our living standards and grow our prosperity for generations to come. So where it makes economic sense to reduce our emissions, that's exactly what we should be doing, and that's what we're doing here in New South Wales, Laura.
All right, we need a whole hour to talk about the rest of that climate issue, but let's talk about stamp duty. You and the Premier are on the same page here?
The Premier and I are always on the same page. We'll
That's
look at all the options available to make housing more affordable in New South Wales. So there's a suite of measures that we're considering to make that a reality. We're working through the process and we're going to land on a policy that's in the best interest of the citizens of this state.
So does that mean replacing stamp duty with land tax?
Well, what it means is we're going to come up with the best policy that's in the interest of
But that was the previous
the people of
Treasurer
New
and now
South Wales.
Premier's policy. Has that changed?
Well, what the previous Treasurer and now Premier's policy was to come up with a plan that will make housing more affordable in New South Wales. We know that stamp duty reform is one lever that could be pulled that will make home ownership even more affordable. But obviously, we need to manage a whole range of equity issues around that, and there are some short-term fiscal impacts. So we need to work through those things. But there may be other solutions that could also help us address the issue of housing affordability here in New South Wales. We're looking at all these options to make housing more affordable, and we'll come back to you once we've landed on a final position.
All right, I'm looking forward to that. Come back to us very soon. Matt Kean, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Great to always be with you. Thanks, Laura.